So when we do literary criticism, we are looking at different ways to analyze the literature that we read. We want to find different ways to analyze the layers of interpretation based on our life experiences. For a good story is like an onion that you peel, and then in the core of the story is the truth. And so each reader brings with him his or her unique life experiences in order to bring about different interpretations of anything that we read. So feminism literary criticism involves, so here is an article by Linda Napakowski. And so feminine literary criticism, also known as feminist criticism, is the literary analysis that arises from the viewpoint of feminism, feminist theory, and or feminist politics. In other words, when we analyze the role of women in literature, that's feminist literary criticism. A feminist literary critic resists traditional assumptions while reading a text. In addition to challenging assumptions which were thought to be universal, feminist literary criticism actively supports including women's knowledge in literature and valuing women's experiences. The basic methods of feminist literary criticism include identifying with female characters. By examining the way female characters are defined, critics challenge the male-centered outlook of authors. Feminist literary criticism suggests that women in literature have been historically presented as objects seen from a male perspective. Re-evaluating literature and the world in which literature is read by revisiting classic literature, the critic can question whether society has predominantly valued male authors and their literary works because it has valued males more than females. Feminist literary criticism recognizes that literature both reflects and shapes stereotypes and other cultural assumptions. Thus, feminist literary criticism examines how works of literature embodies patriarchal attitudes or undercuts them, sometimes both happening within the same work. So in other words, when we read literature, we tend to look at the literature from a masculine point of view, because most of the literature that we read are written by men, written from a male's point of view. So when we look at literature and we see what's the role of women, how would a woman react? That's feminist criticism. And so you revisit that same literature, such as we're doing Trifles, and we're seeing that the men act so condescending to the women. And it's actually the women in Trifles that solve the murder. And so when men write literature, for example, in the poem The Last Duchess from a previous week, women are presented as objects of love or lust, seen from a male perspective. And so the male is the one that controls or dominates the landscape, and the woman is passive and just reacts to whatever the male says. So when we engage in feminist criticism, like we're doing this week in week 7, and we're examining the female point of view, that is how we do feminist literary criticism. And when we do feminist literary criticism and we see things from someone else's point of view, that's how we undercut stereotypes. We undercut the stereotype that a woman is weak, and that a woman has no intelligence, and that a woman has no will of her own, that a woman is just property or a child, to be treated as a child. And so feminist literary criticism recognizes that literature both shapes and reflects stereotypes. And so when we look at something from another person's point of view, the idea is to get rid of those stereotypes and see the world as it really is. And that U.S. society at the turn of the 20th century was a male-centered society. So when we want to say male-centered, that's known as patriarchal, meaning that it's the man who's in control. If we say matriarchal with an M, that's when the woman is in control. And in ancient times, women were in control. Like very, very ancient Africa, women were in control, and those were matriarchal societies. So feminist theory and various forms of feminist critique began long before the formal naming of the school of literary criticism. In so-called first wave feminism, the woman's Bible, written in the late 19th century by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, is an example of a work of criticism firmly in this school, looking beyond the more obvious male-centered outlook and interpretation. And this, I assume, is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. During the period of second wave feminism, academic circles increasingly challenged the male literary canon. Feminine literary criticism has since intertwined with postmodernism and increasing complex questions of gender and societal roles. There we go with the word postmodernism. So if you've been looking at my PowerPoint on literary periods, you should know what postmodernism is. So in modernism, which was the beginning of the 20th century, and that's when you had the Industrial Revolution, and you had technology seen as something very positive, and progress meant that the European settlers took over all of the Indians' land. And so by the time the early 20th century, the United States was fully settled. The Intercontinental Railroad had connected both the eastern part of the United States to the western part of the United States. And after World War I, you had modernism, and then after World War II, postmodernism occurred with the fear of nuclear destruction and the fragmentation of society, and also diversity of voices of different people who are not white, dead white males started to come into the fore as society became more diverse, and also there was a meaningless of life in face of nuclear destruction. And so as different voices in literature started coming and becoming more important, then there rose the feminist literary criticism. And so feminist literary criticism may bring in tools from other critical disciplines, such as historical analysis, psychology, linguistics, sociological analysis, and economic analysis. Feminist criticism may also look at intersectionality, looking at how factors including race, sexuality, physical ability, and class are also involved. Feminist literary criticism may use any of the following methods: deconstructing the way that women characters are described in novels, stories, plays, biographies, and history, especially if the author is male. Deconstructing how one's own gender influences how one reads and interprets a text, and which characters and how the reader identifies depending on the reader's gender. Deconstructing how women autobiographers and biographers of women treat their subjects, and how biographers treat women who are secondary to the main subject, who tends to be male. Describing relationships between the literary text and ideas about power and sexuality and gender. And so that actually occurs in trifles: power, sexuality, and gender. So in trifles, who has the power? The men. Who does not have the power? The women. And so it all depends on your gender. So trifles is a critique of patriarchal or woman marginalizing language, such as a universal use of the masculine pronouns he and him. Noticing and unpacking differences in how men and women write. For instance, where women use more reflexive language and men use more direct language. Reclaiming women writers who are little known or have been marginalized or undervalued, sometimes referred to as expanding or criticizing the canon. The usual list of important authors and works. Examples include raising up the contributions of early playwright Ara Bine and showing how she was treated differently than male writers from her time forward, and the retrieval of Zora Neale Hurston's writing by Alice Walker. Reclaiming the female voice as a valuable contribution to literature. That is one of the main objectives of the feminist criticism, is that the female voice is just as important as the male voice. And so part of postmodernism is to reclaim the voices that were marginalized or undervalued in modernism. Remember that at the turn of the century, when you had modernism, F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby. Although it's a great book, but it's written by a white male. The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. Also a great book, but it's also the point of view of a white male. And so when we do feminist literary criticism, we reclaim the female voice as a valuable contribution to society. In other words, we study works of literature written by women, written by a woman's point of view, in order to learn different perspectives. The more perspectives we learn, then the more we learn about humanity. Because after all, God made us all. We're all God's children. And the more we learn about humanity, the more we learn about God. So getting back to the feminist literary criticism, analyzing multiple works in a genre as an overview of a feminist approach to that genre. For example, science fiction or detective fiction. And did you notice that most of the detectives tend to be male? The very few female Sherlock Holmes is not a female. So all the best detectives all tend to be male. So whenever you think about the captain of the Enterprise, usually you think of Captain Kirk, also a male. And so when we do literary criticism, we tell people, well, you need more diversity on that starship. Therefore, you should have, when you write your stories, you should include a female as a captain, for example. So that is an example of reclaiming the female voice in feminist literary criticism. So when we reclaim the female voice, we're able to take a feminist approach to that genre. And you can analyze multiple works by a single author, often female. You can examine how relationships between men and women, those assuming male and female roles, are depicted in the text, including power relations. And that is very evident in trifles. So when we take apart the text and we notice it's the females who solve the mystery, it's the males that are condescending. So what we're doing is that we're deconstructing the text. We're analyzing it from the inside. We're peeling away the onions to get to the truth of the matter. And for trifles, the truth of the matter is Minnie Wright just couldn't stand her husband, had to kill him in order to get out from under him. And so you examine the text to find ways in which patriarchy is resisted or could have been resisted. And so in all of the feminist literature that we read this semester, such as the Story of an Hour. So Mrs. Mallard, she escaped her husband by simply dying. In The Awakening, the wife also steps into the ocean and kills herself, and that is how she escapes her husband. And in The Yellow Wallpaper, she escapes her husband through insanity, because she thinks that she could see the wallpaper moving. So, and feminist literary criticism is distinguished from gynocriticism because feminist literary criticism may also analyze and deconstruct literary works written by men, whereas gynocriticism, I guess that would be like hyper-feminist criticism on steroids. That means that we only analyze works of literature written by women for women. So that's gynocriticism. So gynocriticism refers to the literary study of women as writers. It is a critical practice exploring and recording female creativity, regardless of race. She could be a black female, a Chinese female, a Hispanic female, a white female, a female. So gynocriticism includes, or she could be a gay female, lesbian female, any female is under the rubric gynocriticism. Gynocriticism attempts to understand women's writing as a fundamental part of female reality. Some critics now use gynocriticism to refer to the practice and gynocritics to refer to the practitioners. American literary critic Elaine Showalter coined the term gynocritics in her 1979 essay, Toward a Feminist Poetics. Unlike feminist literary criticism, which might analyze works by male authors from a feminist perspective, Gynocriticism wanted to establish a literary tradition of women without incorporating male authors. Showalter felt that feminist criticism still worked within male assumptions, while Gynocriticism would begin a new phase of women's self-discovery. And so what we're doing this, and here is her references, and she used MLA. In case you're wondering why is a date at the end of the reference, whatchamacallit, then that's because she used MLA. She didn't use, but that's okay. And for you guys, if you want to use this in your essay or in your trifles analysis, this is the correct APA for you guys to use. And if you want to ask me why she used MLA while you use APA, you could feel free to email me, but I'm not going to tell you within the boundaries of this video. Okay, so getting back to it, so for this week, in week 7 and week 8, as we do our drama unit, we're going to be engaging in feminist literary criticism, where we're going to take apart the text, deconstruct the text, to reclaim the female voice, and to see how women, or analyze the role of women in literature. And that's how we engage in feminist literary criticism. If you have any questions about this video or about feminist criticism, you can always email me.